Augustine of Hippo, who lived from 354 to 430, is famous for many things and is one of the most influential theologians in the history of Western theology. But one of the areas where he has had an enormous influence is on what we mean by human nature. The Augustinian legacy has been incredibly important for Western Christianity and indeed Western society. With me is Dr. Megan Lemonnier, who's a postdoctoral research fellow with us and who has been working on Augustine and human nature. First of all, Megan, you're very welcome.
Thank you.
Tell us something about Augustine and human nature.
I think Augustine is one of the reasons why we love him so much is just that he was such a curious and kind of inquisitive person about himself. And so usually what I like to emphasize with what Augustine thought about human nature is that I think he was always in pursuit of that question and never fully arriving at an answer. And so I think the first thing that is good to remember when we're thinking about Augustine and human nature is the sense in which to be human is to be a mystery to ourselves. So Augustine says at one point in the Confessions, I've become a question to myself. And so I think this is just the first thing to say, that he never arrives at kind of a final, complete answer about what it means to be human. So that's one thing to emphasize. But he goes on to emphasize a few other points that I think are also important to raise. So he has this idea of being created ex nihilo, or out of nothing. And so that's that sort of forms a foundation, I think, for a lot of other points then that he has to say about human nature. So to be created out of nothing for Augustine means that we are completely dependent upon God for our existence. And then the extent to which we turn away from God is to sort of start to slide back into nothingness. And I think Augustine would say that we are not in danger of ever sliding completely back into nothingness because we're always held in God, but that we find our being by abiding in God. And so it's this idea that we come from nothing, and the only reason we can exist at all is because God has brought us into being. So creatio ex nihilo, or being created out of nothing, is very fundamental to what he thinks about human nature. And I think it helps him to explain also some of the really perplexing aspects of human nature about why evil exists in the world, why do we have a tendency to sin. And so he'll talk about original sin as well, but I think fundamental to all of that is this notion that because we come from nothing, we always have sort of a little tendency to slide back into nothingness, and that we have to be held in being by God. So that's the first thing I would emphasize.
Okay, so for Augustine, absolutely central to the human being is that the human being is dependent.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. Right, now let's move on from there.
Okay. And I would emphasize that for Augustine is to be dependent on God, but also to be dependent on others. And so he has also this notion that the primal sin of Adam and Eve was that he uses the phrase that they failed to cling to one another. And I think that's actually really powerful still for us today, that it's to our own destruction that we forget that we belong to each other, and that we need each other. And this is something that Augustine was very obsessed with, this idea really that we're so united, all the way down even to the basic material of what makes up our bodies, that we, if we forget that, then it's sort of a guarantee that we'll find our own destruction. And so remembering to cling to one another is also key, I think, for how he understands what it means to be a human.
And that's what he would later develop in his whole theology of friendship.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
And are there any other areas that we should think about when we think of Augustine and the human being?
Another thing I would emphasize, I think that's really central to how he understands what it means to be human, is to be human is to exist in time. And so God for Augustine is outside of time and is therefore stable and unchanging. And the human person is, he talks about being distended in time, so we're sort of stretched out across time. And because of this, it's part of the reason why understanding what human nature is always kind of slippery for Augustine, because it's somewhat in our memory, it's in the past, but then the present is constantly slipping away, and we reach out towards the future as well. So this aspect also of being in time is central for Augustine, to be a mutable creature, which also then means that we will to be human is to be always changing and always in motion, and that can become disorderly, I think he would say, if you don't abide in God. But if you abide in God, then you can kind of join the harmonious pattern of the divine life.
So for Augustine, we're only having our being moment by moment. We have a sort of a tenuous command on being, and at the same time, we're in an absolute dependence on God in his famous use of this code word, creatio ex nihilo, but equally this dependence on others for our own existence and for our flourishing.
Yes, yeah. And I think this is important to emphasize because sometimes people read the Confessions and they think Augustine is saying that in order to understand yourself, you need to turn inwardly and go sort of by yourself in a room or something, encounter God in the silence of yourself. And I think that's an aspect of what he's saying, but also for Augustine, to find God and then to find ourselves is to be immersed in the life of the church. And so it's not then a kind of solitary process of finding ourselves, but we find ourselves by encountering God, and that mainly happens, I think, for Augustine in the communal life of the church.
Megan, thank you very much.
You're welcome.